Yeah, good morning. Another week, and I'm through with everything what you directly need for your term paper, especially the somehow little econometric task which you should do estimating this law of Okun, a dependence between unemployment and economic growth. And now we want to go a little bit further for the guys who have already participated in my macro course. There we started to build up a general model for the whole economy. And at first we looked only at production from the consumption side. Then we introduced also the money market, and then we introduced also prices, and this was called the ASAD model, aggregated demand, aggregated supply. And something similar we will do now, because when we are looking at this dependence here, then we also do not find a very fundamental variable in the economy. There we do not find the prices. And this we want now introduce, and this concept is a very famous one, because now we want to deduce dependence between inflation, so the development of prices, and unemployment. And because in general, when we look at the government and what they want to do, then of course, in general, welfare is the great target. And there, in general, we know that a situation with a slight economic growth in developed countries between 1 to 3%, this should be in general the aim. But this is hard to it is hard to do, or to do direct economic policy just really directly attacking the economic growth situation, because this is the whole economy. And what you can directly influence via economic policy, this is the price level or inflation in general. Think of investment, where you can directly steer via the interest rate from the central bank. You can, since the interest rate is, so to speak, the price of credits, then you can somehow steer these price level or the inflation, because if you are rising the interest rate, then in general the investment will drop, so demand will drop, and so in the end inflation will drop. So inflation can be directly attacked, and of course also unemployment can directly be attacked if you are introduce from the government specific programs, and in general also the government is measured by the voters. How is the labor market evolving over time? So if the unemployment rates really rises, then it is a question if the government will be re-elected. And And for this, in general, we find more or less direct quantitative numbers for targeting the inflation rate and unemployment. So for inflation in general, you know that we have in Europe, in the European Monetary Union, the specific target of 2%. And if you look in general in the constitution of the central banks over the world, then you very, very often find these 2% or something in the neighborhood, that you have something like a corridor. Inflation should be something between 2 and 3 or around 3%. So this is a very general target. Or also during or in the aftermath of the financial crisis, there the Fed also had a specific target that they tried to steer the economy, and they said, well, we will start to rise interest rates again in order to fight inflation when the employment has dropped to 6%, so that in the United States the unemployment rates shouldn't be higher than 6%. And yeah, in general, we say that we are looking at these two variables. So inflation depends on the price level, because it is the relative change of the price level, and GDP, as we have seen via Okun's law, is directly related to unemployment. And therefore, we now want to have a deeper look into the dependence between inflation and unemployment. And this concept is again known after a famous economist, again in the years where also Okun has done his research. This was also an American guy called Phillips, who did an analysis also in the 1950s, where he found a direct dependence between inflation and unemployment. And this dependence we will roughly derive from the general dependencies. So at first, we look how is in general inflation defined. And inflation is just defined as the change of price level divided by the price level of the former period. So this is the absolute change of price level. And this, of course, we can rewrite as the inflation factor minus 1. And of course, if we want to steer the economy, we do not only want to look ex post what has happened in history, but we want to look in the future, because we want to steer the economy in, so to speak, the right direction. And therefore, we are also interested in the expected inflation. And the expected inflation is, of course, defined in a similar way as inflation, when we just interchange the price level in the future by the expected price level in time period t. So this is then the expected absolute change in prices. And of course, we use the dependence between output and unemployment as we have defined it as the change of unemployment relative to the natural rate of unemployment with this Okun parameter. And since I want to have this parameter to be a positive number, I define it with a minus sign in front of the bracket. And that this is equal to the so-called relative output gap, the GDP minus the potential output. So again, this was GDP and this is potential output. And these two definitions now we are putting together using our aggregate supply curve. And remember this aggregate supply curve, there we defined that the aggregate supply is dependent on the absolute price level. That in general we are fluctuating around potential output, and from the supply side that we have in general this positive dependence on the price level. This was the argumentation via the three different argumentations in the new Keynesian form, that we say if we are surprised by an actual higher price level compared to our expected price level. So what does it mean? From the supply side, we of course are planning our production in the future depending on our expected prices, on the prices for what I can sell my product. Because remember, revenue is prices times quantity. And if I have the target to have a revenue in the future, I'm planning with a revenue of 1 million euros, then I have to have an idea where are the prices tomorrow. And due to for what can I sell my products in the future, I'm planning how much I will produce. So maybe I have the expectation that I can sell my products for 2 euros. I have the target to have a revenue of 1 million. Then this would mean that I will start to produce 500,000 units, because 2 times 500,000 is 1 million. So now I'm starting to produce, and if now I am surprised by a higher rise of the prices in the future. So if my expectation were wrong, that I can sell my products for a higher price, then of course I have an incentive to also increase my production, because I can sell my products for a higher price than I have expected. And this is, yeah, so to speak, the qualitative argumentation that on an aggregate level, I have a positive dependence on the price level if the price level is higher than the expected price level, because then this is a positive number. So positive dependence between price level and aggregated price level PT and aggregated production YT. Well, and now I just use my definition of inflation via the inflation factor and expected inflation via the expected inflation factor. Because here I find the price level and here I find the expected price level. And this I just solve for the expected price level and the actual price level. And these definitions I just insert into my AS curve. Of course, potential output doesn't change. And then I obtain, if I insert these two definitions in the AS curve, I obtain the new dependence where now output is depending on inflation and expected inflation. And then you see, if I multiply this out, then I have PT minus 1 plus PT minus 1 times PT minus PT minus 1. So this cancels then, this factor here and this factor here. And I obtain in the end the dependence that the actual today's output is depending on potential output times the price level in history in T minus 1. But this is of course known. I know where the price level last year was. This I know from the data. And therefore this is also just a number. And then I can redefine this known number times my parameter, so the sensitivity, how much is due to the argumentation via the aggregate supply curve, how is the dependence, how strong is the dependence between output and the relative change of prices. So PT minus 1 times A is also just a number, is a parameter, and this I redefine as a new number. And of course, I assume that prices are positive, and therefore I just obtain, so to speak, then a similar dependence of output depending on the change of price level in a similar way that output is in a similar way depending on the change of inflation relative to expected inflation. And so this we have seen in the macro curves, where we had on the vertical axis our price level and on the horizontal output. And this just translates in the same dependence of a positive dependence between inflation and output. So the higher inflation, the higher is output. And now we are using Okun's law, where we have the inverse dependence of the change of unemployment relative to natural unemployment and the output gap. And then we can rewrite also using also the new variable a tilde, since output, potential output, this we assume is a long run number. Potential output doesn't fluctuate every year. Remember, this was our general long-term growth trend of our economy. There we assume for the next 3, 5, 10 years, this is then roughly the same, if not really anything very dramatic is happening. And therefore, then we can also say that the parameter of Okun times potential output is also just another number, a tilde. So we are just multiplying this version to, this becomes then minus a times potential output times relative change of unemployment equals absolute change in output relative to potential output. And this is our new parameter a tilde. And this now we solve for the actual output for GDP in 1 year. And remember from the former slide, I think I just can copy this. Oops. Yep. Or let's put it here. Up. And this was YT from the AS curve. Dependence between output and inflation from the AS curve. Here I have the dependence between output and unemployment from Okun's law. And now I can just equate these two equations. And this then means that I obtain potential output equals minus A tilde equals actual output. And on the other side from the AS curve, this also equals potential output plus small a tilde times change of inflation rate. Then potential output is canceling. And then I just divide by my parameter small a tilde and I obtain capital A over small a. This, as we have argued, are just two parameters of our model, a fixed number. And this I call now a third new parameter that I do not have so much letters in my formula. And then I end up with this famous dependence of inflation equals expected inflation minus some positive parameter beta times the relative gap of unemployment relative to natural rate of unemployment. And yeah, this is the original form which Phillips used, using again data from the United States. If he could then find, using Okun's law, a positive dependence between unemployment. So unemployment is dropping when if the prices are rising. And this, since I can, as I argued, somehow steer the inflation rate via government programs. So if I give via the government just money to everybody, so if everybody has €1,000 or $1,000 more, then this increases demand, and shifting outward the demand curve means the prices are increasing, that then unemployment rates are falling. And yeah, this is somehow then used by the politicians, and this was called riding the Phillips curve. So also remember the magic square where we had the different targets, and there we had especially the two targets, unemployment and inflation or price level stability. And there, of course, we have somehow a trade-off, but of course, the politicians want to be re-elected, and the probability to be re-elected is in general higher the lower the unemployment rate. Because then if the people have labor, if they are in labor, they will be in general more happy. And therefore they said, well, okay, let's push a little bit more the inflation rate. I know too much inflation is also not good, but let's just a little bit increase the inflation rate, because then, due to the data, I see that the unemployment rates are dropping, and this is therefore then my target. And yeah, here, hopefully this is working. You can also click on this. Is it working? Yep. And this one too. So these are the two links to these two famous papers. So the first one is the econometric analysis. Here you see of over almost 100 years. Oh, sorry, not the United States, the United Kingdom, where he have found this dependence we have derived here. And then later on, especially Edmund Phelps has introduced this argumentation via the expected inflation. And yeah, later on also he obtained, together with Robert Lucas, who has also worked about this, the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2006 for his research. Yeah, and now, yeah, we want to look at this dependence in more detail, because if this dependence would be in general a very stable dependence, then of course every politician has always the incentive to always increase inflation, because then if this would be stable, we can decrease unemployment rate. But we will also have a look in a minute on the long-term dependence. Okay, so in general, we can summarize that the inflation depends once on the expected inflation and the deviation of unemployment from the natural rate of unemployment. And yeah, in general, since of course we don't know what is happening in the future. Think, for example, yesterday in Jamaica with near the hurricane. There always something is happening, and therefore, in general, in economic models, we are introducing some error term which represents that always something can happen in the future. So this we have not derived in our first model, but then in general to create this stochastic component, in general, then we say, well, of course, we have always a slight general fluctuation, and this is then found in our error term, which represents then somehow a supply shock. And yep, pardon? Well, this can be positive or negative. Epsilon. Epsilon. This is a Greek letter. Epsilon. This is a Greek E. Maybe you have used this letter also in statistics when you have talked about errors, because this is a general the variable when you are talking about errors. Yeah. So the main, what we always use is alpha, beta, epsilon, pi. Yeah, and if we need then more letters, then we have also eta. This is nu. What else do we use? U. And more or less that's it. Or oh, xi, she maybe. But this is used when you're using the so to speak chi-squared distribution. But okay. Yeah. And this is then the so-called short run Phillips curve. Why short run? There again, remember how we derived this dependence between inflation and unemployment. We used also the short or medium term AS curve. Because in a minute, then we ask ourselves what happens then in the long run, because then also the AS curve is changing. So since we put in our model the short run view from the supply side, we call then, not surprisingly, this dependence between inflation and unemployment, also the short run Phillips curve. And this then gives us this general trade-off between between inflation and unemployment. Because again, remember the magic square. We want to have the inflation rate not to be too high, and of course, we want to have a low unemployment rate. Compare the magic square with the target low inflation rates roughly by around 2% and low unemployment rates roughly 3 to 4%. Well, and now we are asking ourselves what happens in the long run. And there, remember, what did we argue in the long run for our dependence between output and prices? And in the long run, we argued that in general, the aggregated output level depends on the general framework of the economy. So what in general can an economy, a country produce in the long run? This, of course, is mainly depending on the general situation of the infrastructure in our country. the general situation of our education level. So how innovative are our people? And the general level of our resource situation. So which kind of raw materials do we have? There we have this general problem that right now we are quite depending on China in raw materials, especially for our products in electronics. So we cannot produce more. Look at our car industry. Right now they have to stop to build cars because they have not anymore the inputs they need. And they do not obtain these inputs no matter what they are paying, because China does not give us these inputs. They use it as a strategic weapon. So in general, this positive dependence of output on prices collapses. And there, remember, then we said Py, this was the short or medium term AS curve, and that this is turning to a vertical long run AS curve. And this long run level here, also about this we have talked when we talked about the natural rate of unemployment. This is again our potential output. What is the general production situation of our country? And this argumentation here, the turning into a vertical line in the long run of the AS curve, we argue in a similar way when we are looking at the Phillips curve. So we are starting with starting point or starting Phillips curve. And then we said, well, we are surprised with a higher price level or with a higher inflation than we have expected. So we start in the short run to increase our production due to this surprise. Increasing production via Okun means unemployment rate is falling. This is the riding of the Phillips curve. But we are in the macroeconomic view now. Now we have this higher price level, this high inflation, and now everybody sees that only just the price level in general has increased. And we realize, well, only the price level, the inflation rate has increased, but we are not more innovative than before. Our infrastructure is not better than before. And realizing this in general in the economy means that in the long run, unemployment is rising again due to our general production situation, to our general potential output, and this potential output is corresponding to our natural rate of unemployment. So if we have a dynamic view on this Phillips curve, then this means, let's say, maybe riding the Phillips curve, that this happens for 1, 2, maybe 3 years. That this we can do, because in this time window, everybody can be surprised. But then we are learning that only the prices have changed. And then, over time, at first, we have the decrease of unemployment, and then we step back to the natural rate of unemployment. And somehow, if we look right now at the situation of the German economy, somehow we are just in such a situation. Because we want, or we have started to really push the economy via these huge programs of 500 billion euros, which we want to invest over the next years. So roughly, if we also add the increase of the military budget, we have decided that we want to push the economy with programs of roughly 100 billion euros per year over the next 5 or 10 years. This, of course, will or can, in the short run, push the economy. But if we are not using these investments to really change the general situation of our economy, then we should not be surprised that in the end we fall back to the natural rate of unemployment, or that we still are in this situation where we are right now in the German economy, where I think the last estimation for potential growth is roughly only 0.5, 0.6%, which is much too low to have a stable economy. So, and if this then happens, what has happened then? If we fall back, having this high inflation rate to natural output, we have nothing gained, because we are at the same level of unemployment, now only with a higher inflation rate. And again, think of the magic square. The labor market has, in the long run, not changed. We have not improved. But the target of price level has disimproved. And then we are overall, in the long run, worse off. So in Germany, we really have to realize that we have to change the general situation of our economy. Otherwise, these huge programs, I also think that we need them, that it is positive that we are doing this. But if we put the money only in more consumption, then in the long run, we will be worse off in our country, unfortunately. And we really have to carefully look what we are doing with this money in the next years. Well, and of course, what I have done now is that I argued within my model. I only argued theoretically. And again, we have to look at the data. Is this really reasonable, or do I find this development of increasing inflation, decreasing unemployment, and then again starting to increase unemployment back to the natural rate. And this I did again, since I have longer time series than for the United States. And the numbers here, these are the years. So this is 1961. And I took the data. Oh, this is German. So this is unemployment. And here I have the inflation. And if I go back into the 60s of the United States, then you really see here, I find roughly 5, almost 10 years, this negative dependence. Unemployment rate is decreasing and inflation rate is slightly increasing. But then in the 70s, I see again that I have, so to speak, an outward shift of the short run Phillips curve. And this is then somehow going back this to number 3 here in my theoretical argumentation. And that then I find a new outward shifting short run Phillips curve. And this Phillips curve I again can write. And here, maybe, of course, this is quite poor in the estimation. I took here also only 4 data points. And I remember when I talked about the statistics, well, here you can make a question mark if I really can do it. But if you roughly look at it, you can somehow say, well, I find here this outward shift. And then going again 5 years forward in time, I again find this outward shift here. But also I have a quite poor R squared with only 0.3. But also look at this time window here. These are the 10 years in the 1970s. And within this time window, I have the 2 major shocks of the 2 oil crises. In the beginning of the 1970s and then in the end of the 1970s, where the Iran-Iraq war are starting. And of course, that in such times where I have really huge external shocks, that then a general economic argumentation is maybe not valid. This is also not surprisingly, because, so to speak, my framework is dramatically changing. But then in the 1980s, here you see I even have another outward shift of this Phillips curve, and here I have a quite high or reasonable R squared of 0.8, where I can say, well, these almost 5 to 10 years in the 1980s until the fall of the Berlin Wall, that there we have a quite stable economic situation where I find these dependence, this argumentation via the Phillips curve. So then let's go on. Oops, this is again unemployment. And then, yeah, I go further. Again, I have a low. And then in the 90s, something maybe funny happened. That if I take the data in the 90s, I have an inverse dependence on the data between unemployment and inflation. so that it is inverted, that I have a positive dependence between unemployment and inflation. And then, of course, my general argumentation within my model with the Phillips curve has collapsed. But maybe also this is also not that surprising, because in general in the 1990s there I have this global, or this dramatic global change, that I have not anymore this opposition between East and West, the Soviet Union and the United States. So that in this time, yeah, the global economy, the global dependencies are really changed. Right? The whole eastern part of Europe, additionally with the Soviet Union, now entering the global markets. And in these times, we have to admit that we didn't see in the data the the dependence from this model of the Phillips curve. And this we also, when we want to use economic models in order to initiate economic policy programs, we always have to look in the data, well, is in this situation right now my model valid? Can I really argue in this situation with my model? And this you also can compare with the end of the macro curves, where I have introduced these two different views on the economy, the neoclassical one and the Keynesian one. I always have to ask myself, are we right now more in a framework where I have to apply a neoclassical view, or am I more in a framework where a Keynesian view is more valid? And also, I should not be, yeah, yeah. So I should not be so fixed in my view that I always say I have always to argue in a Keynesian view. Because in the Keynesian view, I can always argue, well, let's push the economy via the government. Let's do it, let's do it, let's do it. This we have done almost 10 years. And then we have seen the start of the increase of inflation. And then we had even this dramatic increase of inflation, more than 10% in 1 year in 2022. Okay, and the last ones is then I did the analysis until until Corona, and yeah, we have done a quite stable situation in the beginning of the millennium with this R squared of 0.5. And if we look there in ex post in history, then we also can say this was economically a quite stable situation. So after, let's say, the first 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had a large turmoil of the general situation of the global economy. And then in the beginning of the millennium, we can say more or less this stabilizing trend of globalization in general, and of the step in especially of China into the global markets. That this in general stabilized the global economy overall. But then, of course, unfortunately, we had the financial crisis, and we had then also the time in between financial crisis and Corona. And this is the period here, the red one. And there we have a somehow small negative dependence as we find it in the argumentation of the Phillips curve, but again with a very poor R squared. And yeah, if we look at this 10 years between financial crisis and Corona, there we also have to admit that via two sides, via fiscal policy from the government, we really did very many things in the economy. So we are really changed the markets and the market prices via the fiscal policy, and of course even more dramatic in my view via the monetary policy, because we really dropped the interest rates to 0% and even in the negative interest rates within these 10 years after the financial crisis until Corona. So this decade, was a decade where, we had really a huge influence on the markets, so that in general we cannot, talk that in general we have, so to speak, really free markets, or we have to admit that we really manipulated the markets. For example, when we look at the monetary policy, what we have done via the ECB, during this time, we hold via the ECB 1/3 of our general government debt in Europe. So we financed ourselves via printing money. And this, of course, manipulated especially the capital markets, where one of the main variables are the interest rates. And that then, within such a period, again, we do not find a very stable dependence via an argumentation which comes from the general market process, from the so-called ASAD model, where we have an aggregate demand and an aggregate supply. So this will come into equilibrium if the prices can freely fluctuate. And if we really manipulate this price mechanism, then of course it is not surprisingly that our general argumentation within such a model also collapses, and we don't see it in the data. Yeah, well, and then came Corona, and now we are 3 years behind Corona. And of course, these 3 years, this is too short to really say, do we find again really a stable situation where we can say already that we have a new Phillips curve? This will show the future. But I think when we look especially over the Atlantic, what is happening in the United States and also what is happening in China, we shouldn't be surprised that in the next years we will not find a very stable economic situation. But maybe you can also have a look in your country data. Especially in the last 3 years, maybe you already find some dependence, because especially price data, inflation in general, you find a monthly time series, and also for unemployment, quite often you have monthly time series. So maybe you can write a one page or something about this, just looking at the unemployment and the inflation data, putting this in inflation versus unemployment, and maybe you see something like a Phillips curve or not. This will be interesting. So in general, what we more or less see over these 50, 60 years from the US data, that overall this concept of the Phillips curve, that at first we can write the Phillips curve, then coming back to the natural rate unemployment, then having an outward shift, again going upward, another outward shift. We see it roughly. It is not too stable, this dependence, but in general, I showed you that in the US data we saw this outward shift of the short run Phillips curve due to the argumentation that in general the long run Phillips curve would be also vertical as the long run aggregated demand curve, aggregated supply curve, sorry. Yeah, and for this, one should really carefully look always at the government when they say, well, let's just push the economy, and if then slightly the inflation rate starts to increase, this doesn't matter because it is good for the labor market. Because sometimes if this price surprise, because this is argumentation behind it, if this has worked once, then of course politicians have the incentive to do it twice, to do it a third time, and to always try to surprise people. This cannot work because we are learning. And then we are anticipating that, oh, well, I won't be surprised. I see that this push will only push prices. And then I even do not start to increase production. And then I have only, then I'm directly following the long run Phillips curve. And in such a situation, then unemployment will not drop due to our economic policy, due to our push. And if I want to apply this permanently, then in the long run, I will have a situation that I have not anymore this negative dependence, but that I am then stuck in a low economic growth situation and a situation of high unemployment. And again, looking at our economy in Germany right now, we have this situation of a stagnation in the economic performance or even a decrease. The last 2 years, we had a slight decrease in GDP, in real GDP in Germany. And also we have this starting increase of unemployment over the last 2 years. So somehow we are now in a situation which we call then stagflation. Stagflation is then meant a situation low low economic growth and high inflation rates. Because in general, in a minute, um, we would in general argue if we have uh, low economic growth rates, this would mean that we have low demand, so no high price pressure. So in general, in such a situation with low economic growth, we would expect that we have also low inflation rates. But right now, well, the inflation rates are not too high, but we also have to admit that the decrease in the last year of the inflation rate was mainly due to the drop of the very high energy prices. And this influence of the drop of energy prices, this is now done. The next month, we do not have anymore this effect from falling energy prices, because in the next month we are comparing the today's energy prices with the energy prices 12 months ago, and these prices are more or less the same. And therefore, it is forecasted that in the next months we also obtain a slight increase of inflation rates again in the direction of 3%. And also we have the situation of the increase of unemployment. So maybe now we are in such a situation in Germany, which is a very bad one, that we are in a situation of a low performing labor market and relatively high inflation rates. And hopefully the government is doing the right things in the next months or years that we come out of this situation. Because somehow we see a little struggle in the government in Germany. Maybe you have also heard that the minimum wage will be now increased in Germany, and also the discussion about what shall happen to our social security system, especially to our so-called Bürgergeld. What shall happen with this? Because we have the situation that the government has, yeah, so to speak, quite much money, because we have decided, remember, roughly 50 to 100 billion euros per year, which the government can use. And of course, some people then have the incentive to take just this money to stabilize only the demand and not investing it in education, infrastructure, and unfortunately also in the military. Well, and we are not only in Germany in this situation. The other countries are somehow not that bad, but if we also look at France, for example, then they are also not in the very best situation right now. And yeah, but the future will show what will happen. Okay, so this was then today the concept of the Phillips curve, the dependence between unemployment and prices, and yeah, that we find this dependence, especially the argumentation that the Phillips curve can become vertical, that we are maybe somehow right now in such a situation. That some people say, well, let's further increase inflation. And also, if we look overseas to Mr. Trump, he is now, or the government there is now starting, because Mr. Powell, the president of the central bank of the Fed, he is leaving next year. And now the government wants to implement a new person which who just um, much earlier starts to decrease interest rates. But this also then, of course, will push inflation. Okay, so you had another question? Okay. Okay, then we are done. And maybe for the guys who have already participated in macro, next or tomorrow, sorry, not next week, tomorrow I will quite fast redo the so-called ISLM model, but we will do it in a slight more general way than we have done it in our introductory course. And then we want to use this ISLM model to especially talk about especially monetary policy. So that's for today. Then let's see tomorrow.